Welcome, everybody. This is live from the field, Climate Change in Our Watershed. Really quickly, here are some guidelines for the Zoom event. So all the participants are muted and your videos are off, so please keep them that way for the remainder of the event. And just type in anything you need from us into the chat. So for example, during the presentations and the live Q&A session with scientists, you can submit questions for them using the chat, and then we'll read them out loud.
Hello, I'm Michael Cohen. I'm here today to tell you about how our research at Sonoma State addresses climate change in two different ways. One is harvesting the sun's energy through these photosynthetic systems that you see here on the right to carry out work that would otherwise need to be done by petroleum or electricity-based engineered systems, and also by creating biomass, like this plant and algae material you see here, that can be converted into fuel that we can use, displacing the need for using petroleum-based fuels. All right, the connection with the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed is that it is our source of biological material. The plants and algae that we use are from the watershed. All right, a little bit about me. I'm an environmental microbiologist, but it wasn't always what I imagined myself doing when I was smaller. I thought I'd be a construction worker. Later, I wanted to be in veterinary medicine. In fact, that's how I entered as an undergraduate to Cal State Northridge. And my interest changed while there for two different reasons. One is I actually was working at a vet hospital and saw what it entailed. And at the same time, I was taking the prerequisite courses, one of which was microbiology, and really liked that. And why do I like it? Well, learning how living things function and interact with each other, yes. And then the microbes in particular are interesting because of their metabolic flexibility. Growing up in Los Angeles, the pollution was pretty bad at that time. And knowing that microbes saw the same things that were toxic to us as energy sources, other kinds of metabolites, that was fascinating to me. Having this position at Sonoma State as a professor in the Department of Biology has given me the opportunity to work with many other people, both on campus and outside of campus, on projects to investigate the natural world. And the one we're working on right now is no exception to that. It draws on the expertise of Dr. Joseph Lin and Dr. Lisa Hua in the department, as well as these international collaborators that you see below. Just as importantly as the contribution of the student researchers, the effort they bring to the projects, and of course what they learn from it. We're an educational institution, and education's the key to our mission. This project that we'll be discussing today is the focus of Bell Ehrman Trout's research. You'll be meeting her in a second. A little bit about the source of our organisms. It's the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed. All the algae and plants you saw are derived from the Laguna. We create a engineered environment that then selects for whichever organism happens to do the best for a particular time of year. So we will see a succession of organisms in our systems. We're not forcing one thing to grow. Now, to tell you about how we gather these organisms, we'll hand the narration over to Bell Ehrman Trout.
Hi, my name is Belle. I am a research student in the Cohen lab under the direction of Dr. Michael Cohen, and my research is in environmental microbiology. And I'm currently a freshman at Sonoma State University. I entered as a pre-nursing major, but once I took biology classes, I started to realize that My passion lies more in the realm of looking at the natural world.
This is Turtle Pond here at Fairfield Osborne Preserve. And we're taking this in early April 2021. Bell is sampling Zola folliculoides. This was a member of the macrophyte community at the Laguna treatment plant polishing system. And along with the azole, there's duckweed mixed in there. Duckweed eventually became a dominant member of that community. The other plant of interest in here that we used for our polishing system is hydrocotyle, which is this leafy plant right here. Belle can gather some of that up. It's a valuable resource that we use to remove nitrogen from the treated wastewater and then broke it down. Okay, here we have Belle sampling an algal mat that, if we look at it under the microscope, it'll primarily be composed of a green algae called Edagonium. And this was another dominant member of our community in those polishing channels at the Laguna treatment plant. So we just gathered it up at a site like this, brought it over the treatment plant, and it took hold. There you go. Easy to harvest, as you can see. That was one of the features that we were looking for in plants and algae from nature. Here's a schematic indicating how our biological systems are designed to use nature to accomplish certain tasks. The sun is the power source. Energy is harvested by plants and algae, and they then carry out certain jobs like removing nitrate from water or degrading pollutants. The algae and the plants themselves can generate useful byproducts, like the polysaccharides in our current system can be used for binding up metals from water, or even as a component in certain foods. And as I mentioned, the biomass that's being generated through photosynthesis has energy embodied in it, and other organisms can convert that energy into useful forms, like biomethane through the process of anaerobic digestion. All this, remember, is powered by the sun, keeping us from drawing on the power grid, much of which is derived from fossil fuels, and at the same time generating bioenergy that displaces the need for petroleum fuels. The two systems are spaced a couple of years apart. One was at the Laguna treatment plant. This is the overhead view. We had two gravity flow constructed wetlands with 3 separate channels each, designed to remove nitrate and also degrade endocrine disruptors that mimic estrogen and can feminize male fish. A little bit about how our system worked at the Laguna treatment plant. Here is a side view of the gravity flow wetlands, water flowing through them. We harvested the algal and plant biomass, mixed it with agricultural byproducts like wine lees and glycerin from biodiesel production within these anaerobic digesters. Within these are the microbes that convert all that material into biogas, which contains methane, which can be combusted and turned into electrical power that we use to power some electrical vehicles on the treatment plant campus. The solid digestate that remains after the digestion process could be used as a compost. We used worms to compost it, earthworms, and grew strawberries in the soil amendment with that compost. The water for growing the strawberries came from the treated water, and we had a good harvest. More on this project can be found in this article that will be linked at the end of today's presentation. The current system at Sonoma State has a very different purpose, but it is likewise relying on photosynthetic organisms to initiate degradation of this polylactic acid bioplastic that we use on campus. And Belle will describe how that works.
So right here we have a PLA lid, polylactic acid lid, and this is used from a world-centric donation. They kindly donated a bunch of lids to us and a few boxes over here. And this is the same type of plastic that's actually used at Sonoma State to make lids or straws or many different kinds of plasticky sort of items. And this is actually shredded and put into the tables right here. So picture this getting chopped up in a shredder and put into here. Here we have our pump in which we're cycling water throughout the system that is taking it to the channels with the polylactic acid plastic and our polysaccharides that are being produced. And as you can see here, we have buckets underneath and they are full of water. And what's interesting about this system is that we're not relying on another freshwater source, so we're keeping in with the sustainability theme, and we're not relying on outer nature sources to keep up our system and keep it rolling. So right here we have our pump, which is cycling water out to the system, and in return these systems will produce polysaccharides, which can then be fed to the microbial fuel cell and be used to be broken down with the bioplastics.
I'm Ann Krelock with Sonoma Water. I'm a senior environmental specialist with Sonoma Water. I've been there for a number of years, but I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of my journey, my career path, and then I'd love to share a few slides with you to talk about what I do now and some of the skills that I need for my current position. So I guess one piece of advice I would definitely have is now is the time to take advantage of those opportunities. Get out of your comfort zone, get out of the comfort and safety of your own community and your own household, and go see the world when things come up. You have to seek out those opportunities. And in college, especially at a large university, you really need to seek out your professors and meet them and get to know them and meet the grad students. And just opportunities will come up if you start networking in that way. I didn't necessarily want to be a professor. So I got a master's degree. I went to a state school for that and really wanted to learn skills that would be good in professions in this field, really practical skills. So so in graduate school, while the undergraduate was really about getting a bachelor's, was really about kind of expanding horizons and experimenting and learning new potential jobs and fields out there. Graduate school was about focusing and figuring out a topic and running with it and finishing it. For the last several years, I've been a senior environmental specialist with Sonoma Water. And most of you are probably familiar with Sonoma Water, but I'll give a 30-second overview. Sonoma Water generally provides drinking water to cities and water districts around the area. So Sonoma County and also Northern Marin County and other portions of Marin County as well. So working a lot with the Russian River and a little bit with groundwater. We're not the ones that folks write their water bill checks to. That would be cities and smaller districts. Flood management, managing creeks and other infrastructure to make sure that downtown Santa Rosa doesn't flood, for example. And then sanitation and wastewater, that was something that we took over a little later for a lot of areas, not everywhere. And then a newer role for us is really thinking about climate change and how can we reduce our own impacts on climate change, but also how do we adapt to this changing climate? One of my roles is to think through climate adaptation. So by this, I mean, we've got changing temperatures. We know there's sea level rise. We've already had around 8 inches of sea level rise in the last century. We know there are going to be changes in precipitation patterns. So peak precipitation, so extreme precipitation is going to get more extreme. We're going to have more droughts. We're going to have more wildfire. We're going to have more flooding on our rivers and streams. So given that all of this presents a huge challenge in terms of, for a water agency figuring out how to continue supplying clean, fresh drinking water, and keeping everybody safe in terms of flooding and all of that, what do we do? So we're working on a climate adaptation plan now with a whole bunch of different strategies to address each of those issues listed on this slide. Working with tons of partners to install better radar in our area so that we can detect atmospheric rivers with more precision and know how much rain is actually coming. So here's an image of an atmospheric river coming across to North America and an image of Lake Mendocino, pretty dry. So the idea is to use this science to better manage our reservoirs. So we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers to use this science to update their models to better manage currently Lake Mendocino, and then hopefully expand that to other reservoirs. And so if you see a big storm coming and then it peters out and there's really not much rain that will actually arrive, you don't have to dump a whole bunch of water from your reservoir to make room for the coming rainstorm. So we can preserve that water behind the dam. So this is kind of a groundbreaking study and modeling effort and coordination exercise. My role in this was to help with the environmental analysis to support this project and make it happen. Several years ago, we started thinking and planning for large-scale fire and its potential impacts to water supply, water quality, and the watersheds that feed our rivers and lakes. Lake Sonoma is our primary drinking water source in this region. And the watershed that surrounds it is somewhere around 83,000 acres, give or take. Some of it's in Sonoma County and some of it is in Mendocino County. And we own very, very little of it. So Sonoma Water only owns the parcel in red here within that black watershed boundary. We are not managing these lands that feed the reservoir. So it became very clear to us, even before the 2017 fires, that we needed to start planning for wildfires in this watershed and start meeting our neighbors. Not a lot of people were interested in this topic until after the 2017 fires, and then we were able to get some funding and put together a really great group of agencies. Our forests that have not seen fire are really crowded. You might have way more trees per acre than you would have in previous centuries. So the trees that are there are less healthy, they're stressed for water and nutrients, and they burn more readily. And once you do a little bit of thinning, pull out the ones that are smaller, you end up sequestering more carbon and having healthier, more resilient trees. Grazing is a big one. Sheep, cows, goats can help reduce the vegetation on the ground, and the ladder fuel that brings surface fire up into the canopies, into the crowns of trees, and can make a fire a lot more severe. If we do prescribed burns, then we have the opportunity to bring good fire that restores a landscape onto the land and reduce the risk of a very high severity or much more dangerous catastrophic fire. My work, I met a lot of people who were firefighters, who were prescribed burn practitioners, and others, and it just kind of looked like fun. So I decided to go ahead and become a wildland firefighter on the side. So I volunteer for this organization, Audubon Canyon Ranch, advocating for prescribed fire and bringing good fire back to the land. This is a before and after of a prescribed burn that I was part of in the Lake Sonoma watershed. As you can see, the trees are fully intact and happy. So continuing this work, thinking outside the box, working with non-traditional partners, using science and data, and think about how to protect creeks and endangered salmon from the runoff from those fires. So some of the tasks required and some of the skills needed for my position, analysis and problem solving. So find a specialty and really do your homework and keep up on it. Get organized, ask questions, and find peace with multitasking. A lot of that. Meetings, you need good communication skills, have a good, clear purpose for your meeting, write an agenda, share the spotlight, field work, be able to work in rough conditions. In terms of leadership, think outside the box. We need big ideas, but also be patient because change is very slow. Seek input from people you disagree with and from those who come before you. You don't have to have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers, but make sure to know when you don't know and ask questions and work with colleagues to brainstorm and think up solutions, because you're going to find better solutions if you work as a team. And then last, I would just say, prop up those around you. Be generous with your compliments and your own accomplishments. First of all, to do a prescribed fire, a lot of planning has to take place first. So it can take a very long time to go through the process to plan, to get permits, to get all your resources there, and make sure you have, plan A, plan B, plan C, you have all your emergency information there. And so with that in place, a good fire that jumps over its boundaries should be handled very quickly and be contained very quickly, as long as you have the right resources there. And you also need to be willing to decide on the morning of that the conditions just aren't right. So you can do a lot of planning, have 50 people show up to your burn, and then say, today's just not right. The wind is going to be too much, or the fuels are too dry. And so in that way, you can prevent a good fire from becoming a bad fire.
Thank you for that. This next question is for Mike. And this one is, let me make sure I have it right. At what rate does bioplastic break down? And what is the final product after breaking down? Is there anything that could be useful to humans or the environment?
Good question. And this particular bioplastic, there's different kinds. This PLA is for polylactic acid. That's the same lactic acid that's in yogurt. It's just a small 3-carbon molecule, and they just link it together in an orderly fashion. So when it breaks down, some of you might know the term hydrolysis, breaking apart water across the bond, just releases lactic acid into the environment. Now, out in the world here, even in our system on the tables, it's the lactic acid won't last long. There's a lot of microbes that degrade lactic acid, and we'll use that as a carbon source and basically turn it into carbon dioxide, goes right back into the atmosphere. So that is really what you want to have happen, the stuff to disintegrate completely. As Belle said, we're just looking to use the high pH that the cyanobacteria generate to initiate degradation and then get it into the composters. And we're looking to speed up that process, because I think it's been made clear that it is way too slow right now. Even though technically it's compostable, it's labeled compostable, it's much too slow to be practical. Most composting facilities, the vast majority, cannot accept it. In fact, there's one down the street here, Petaluma Hill Road, that they put some in, but what was that, October 2019, and it's still intact. So they won't accept PLA anymore. So the idea is just get it where it can be composted and disintegrated. True composting is you don't recognize it at the end. It becomes part of that material.
Great. Okay, we have another question for Anne. How do fires affect water resources?
So in a lot of different ways, severe wildfire can, even in the wildlands, in urban areas, obviously you can burn things that are toxic if they run off the following winter and get into your waterways. And in wildlands, especially on steep slopes, a severe fire can really cook your soils. And so those soils become hydrophobic. And instead of those rains coming the following winter, instead of them soaking into the soils, they are repelled by those soils. Depending on the vegetation in the soil and the slope, they can result in a lot of ash and debris flowing downhill into your waterways. That can affect fish habitat, it can affect water quality, and it can impact, one of the things that we're concerned about is it affecting the sands and gravels in the Russian River that we depend on to filter our drinking water. So we use riverbank filtration. The sands and gravels do a great job of filtering out E. coli and other things that we're concerned about. And we think that ash and sediment dumping into the system could really impact that. So that's why fire ends up being a water issue. So we've started exploring all sorts of different partnerships with different agencies to look for solutions. And our partners are our neighbors in the Lake Sonoma watershed as well.
Wow. Yeah, everything is connected. Huey, we have a question for Mike. Mabel already kind of touched on this, but you might have more to add. How effective is bioenergy, and can it be commercialized or widely produced?
Well, so bioenergy already, especially the kind I would just describe in the video about anaerobic digestion, that's widely used. In fact, if you're flushing your toilet at home and you're in the Santa Rosa watershed, it's going to the Santa Rosa Laguna treatment plant, and they use the solids for generating bioenergy, basically biomethane, and that powers about 1/3 of the plant's energy requirements, which is a lot, because moving water, as you know, anyone who's carried water is really takes a lot of energy, and so moving all the water around that system, they can use all the bioenergy they can gather. So that form of bioenergy is widely used, and really, others are, in under research, like biohydrogen and things like that. That's really not ready yet for wide scale use, or it hasn't been employed so much. But some things are more promising and research level right now.
Okay, we have another question for Anne. Do the detriments of logging outweigh the benefits?
Logging is such a big question. And, logging is really about the details, the devil's in the details, so to speak. So the logging of yesteryear that just caused tons of erosion and dumped soil and hillsides into rivers. Northern California has been hit hard by really irresponsible logging in the past. The kind of vegetation management that people are looking at now, organizations like UC Cooperative Extension and the Resource Conservation Districts and others, is really finding locations where, for example, you have oak woodlands that are being invaded by Douglas fir trees. Taking fire off a landscape can result in invasion of other plants that wouldn't normally be there. So our oak woodlands are looking a lot more like Douglas fir forests than they should, than they used to. And so if you see your oak woodland getting invaded by small Doug firs, and you start pulling out those Doug firs that are, really small still, seedlings, and maybe, a couple of inches thick at kind of the DBH, the diameter, Then you're going to restore your oak woodlands. If you do it responsibly, you can do it without causing erosion. You can use grazing to manage some of the species, some of the invasive plants that come and invade oak woodlands and grasslands and shrublands. And that's a way to do things that are restoration, so kind of ecological restoration. And I think that's really a good pathway for moving forward in terms of restoring our natural ecosystems, removing or at least reducing cover of non-native plants that are invading, and then fire fuel reduction. And then once you take those, small Doug firs that are invading your oak woodland out, then the trees that remain end up growing more and sequestering more carbon. And so there's this kind of feedback loop. And then if you do a prescribed burn and continue managing the understory and a big fire does come through, then your remaining trees are healthier and they survive that fire. And it's much less likely to become a severe wildfire.
So,
We have-
and the prescribed burn can help prevent the Douglas firs from getting established in the first place if it's done early enough. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A prescribed fir or a prescribed fire can help control young Doug firs that are invading a landscape.
And you mentioned you're volunteering for an organization. Is that something that you have a link to that you could put in the chat?
Yes. I can do that. And I would love to mention them. They're called Audubon Canyon Ranch. They have a site in the Glen Ellen area and also in Marin and a few other preserves in the area. And they are great about training people to become wildland firefighters and volunteers like me. And they are fantastic. The person who runs their Fire Forward program is named Sasha Berleman, and she has a PhD in fire ecology. So she's not only a firefighter, but she's also an ecologist and is really looking at this as a tool to manage landscapes to make it healthier. She's got a huge team there and they're all working on, ecological benefits of this as one of the tools that we need to use moving forward. So they're called Audubon Canyon Ranch, and I can send out a link.
Thank you.
That would be great. Yeah. Thanks for talking to each other. You guys can ask each other questions. That's totally great. Jump on in if you have something to reply to. And just ironically, the next question in the chat, you've covered some of this, and is how impactful are the prescribed fires, and have you seen a major decrease in Doug fir infestation?
I think there are a lot of people collecting data to answer those questions. I know personally somebody who lost their home in the glass fire in kind of east of Santa Rosa, and they have done a lot of thinning, very responsible conservation thinning on the property, pulling out young Doug firs, etc. We have done several, well, at least prescribed burn in that area. And when the glass fire came through, it really left that area alone in terms of that prescribed burn, the burn unit. And so I don't have a lot of data or statistics at this point because I think the sample size is pretty small, but anecdotally at least, it really looks like that area where there was a prescribed burn didn't burn maybe at all, but at least if it did burn, it was a much less severe burn than the surrounding areas where a lot of homes were lost. There have been other studies in the Sierras and elsewhere looking at different treatment options and how they survived different large-scale fires. And some of the treatments that looked the most promising were thinning followed by prescribed burns or pile burns. So you have to, once you do a little thinning, you're left with all this biomass. And then what do you do with that biomass? And one of the questions is, one, can you create biochar or something that can then be used to sequester carbon into the soil? And if you can't, can you burn piles of this material or take it off site, do a prescribed burn on site or remove that biomass from the site. Anyway, so there are some people studying this issue and looking for solutions to figure out, what actually works. We like to talk about ideas about what may or may not work, but it's really important to look at the data to see what does work, because all of these efforts are really expensive and time intensive.
Okay, we have another question, which is how can you get trained to be a prescribed burn practitioner?
That's a great question. Audubon Canyon Ranch's Fire Forward program is a great place to start. They have been conducting a lot of trainings over the last, a couple of years. I was trained maybe 2 years ago or so, and there are constantly new trainings being scheduled, and they love taking more volunteers and one of the barriers to getting this work done is that there hasn't really been a trained workforce yet. And so workforce development is a really big issue, and you can get trained through that program and do the same thing I do, and maybe I'll see you on the fire line.
This next question goes to Mike. What is the process used to determine whether or not an algae or bacteria will break down plastic?
Well, so the kind of plastic we're working with, this polylactic acid, is subject to degradation in alkaline conditions, basic conditions. And we know we can just put it into something that's very high pH, like sodium hydroxide, and it will dissolve over time. What we're doing is, instead of relying on some chemical means that wouldn't be really practical on a large scale, is to just use the power of photosynthetic microorganisms. And the nice thing about it is that basically, when you see pond scum or some kind of mat on a shallow body of water, that's generating, in the process of photosynthesis, a lot of alkalinity. The water gets very basic. We reach up at about pH 11, which some of you will know that's pretty high. And it doesn't have to be a particular, of course, we inoculated with one that just does well. What we did was we chose one, of course, only needs CO2 for carbon, right? Photosynthesizing. But we also chose one that fixes nitrogen from the air. It doesn't require nitrogen fertilizer, so you don't have to put that into the water. It can just get its nitrogen from the air. But as I said, over the course of the year, it might get displaced by another organism, which is just fine, because that one will invariably be a photosynthesizer too, relying on the sun. And as long as we keep the environment where we want it, it doesn't really matter what particular organism goes there. We always start with a guess, but then it'll go in whatever direction it wants to go.
Okay, another question for Anne is, how is the wildlife affected by controlled fires?
That's a great question. So we as government agencies, whenever we do anything that could impact wildlife or other natural resources, we need to do a lot of environmental compliance. And so whenever my organization, we haven't done our own prescribed burn yet, but I think we will. Whenever we or regional parks or other organizations do a prescribed burn, we would do environmental assessments, site assessments beforehand. We might do nesting bird surveys if it's during the nesting bird season to try to determine if there are any active nests in the area, and we would need to avoid those. There are different requirements for private landowners, but a lot of the prescribed burns that really take place out of the nesting bird season. So maybe winter or late fall is a good season. And most of the burn units most of the prescribed burns that I've been on, people have gone through and prepared the burn unit first. And so I think a lot of wildlife has been flushed from the area first. So I haven't seen personally much impact, like direct impact on wildlife. Now, in terms of habitat, there can be huge benefits to the area in terms of habitat. So a lot of areas are invaded by things like broom, Scotch broom and French broom, which is a really invasive, disturbance-loving species. And once it gets into a site, it can take over that site and be kind of a monoculture. There are a lot of invasive plants like that. And so doing this work to try to remove, and broom is a really rough one to get rid of, but doing this work to remove invasive species can really improve wildlife habitat for terrestrial species, and then also fish as well. There are Native American tribes in Northern California that talk about doing prescribed burns, bringing their, they don't call them prescribed burns, but bringing cultural burns back to their lands and then re-watering the landscape. So all of these very thirsty plants and say invasive Doug firs can be very thirsty. And once you do a little tending, kind of gardening through prescribed fire and other techniques, you end up seeing more water in your creeks. You end up seeing salmon returning to areas that were too dry before. And so there's this kind of celebration around rewatering their creeks and streams. So there can be some really huge benefits to these lands. I think one of the things that we all have to wrap our head around is that the landscape that we see now is not a wild and unimpacted landscape. It's been impacted by non-native plants, traditional kind of ranching practices, and a lack of fire. And so we've done such a great job of suppressing fire that we've really changed these landscapes. And so leaving it alone is not necessarily the best path forward because it's not a natural system anymore, that we need to do a little tending.
It is just like you are reading these students' minds because you guys are giving such perfect segues into the next question. But unfortunately, our event is basically over. So we had some great questions that we didn't get to about involvement of Native American groups, about nitrogen fixing species for Mike, about Lake Sonoma and landowners and working with them. So I think that we can try, if that's all right with you guys, to answer some of those questions by email and send out those answers to everybody after the event. Would that work for you too?
Yeah.
That'd be great. So we get to those
Absolutely.
questions. So I'm going to hand this over to Daniel to do a quick wrap up on his end, and then I'll say a few words.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much to our speakers and audience for attending this program. As a high school student myself, such events have been super helpful as they have shown me snapshots into the lives of STEM professionals, showing real life examples of various science-focused jobs, allowing students like me to gain a more concrete grasp on some of these more complicated fields. Many times, such presentations provided a great opportunity for me as a visual learner to understand complex theoretical science jobs better by being able to see how the work is really done and what a typical professional day would look like in any of these fields. As I go off to college, I will now have a deeper grasp of many scientific vocations, allowing me to make more educated course selections and potential career choices in the future. All thanks to the programs such as the Mind of a Scientist program with the Sonoma Library or the program we have today. Be sure to check out more Mind of a Scientist events every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. You can get Zoom info and learn more about each presenter at sonomalibrary.org/Mind of a Scientist, and we will put that into the chat for you right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It has been such a pleasure working with him on this event, a high school student who just stepped right up into one of these programs. It's been amazing. I want to thank the speakers, Mike Cohen and Krelock, Ben Ehrmantraut. I want to also thank the virtual field for inspiring Live from the Field events, and to the Sonoma Library and all the people that helped make this happen. So if you registered today for the event, then we will send up a follow-up email. So we'll have those answers to questions we didn't get to, a resources document with articles and web links for information about these organizations and projects, and also a link to the recording. You can find recordings of past events with the Center for Environmental Inquiry at cei.sonoma.edu/calendar. And I'm going to put that in the chat in a minute. And I also want to say we still have 6 events this semester. So if you want to come see more things we're doing, we've got more for you. Next Monday is the beginning of Earth Week. We have an event about nature and mindfulness. Then after that, we have the Sudden Oak Death Blitz, which is a really great way of actually getting outside into nature because you can go collect leaves and send them into the lab for testing for free. And then for people who are interested in more in water issues, On May 8th, we have a student-led showcase of research that was done on homelessness and water, which is a really complicated topic. And there's a lot of community organizations that have been involved in that. So I'm going to paste some of these into the chat, and we really hope to see you at these events and others soon. And contact me if you have any needs. My email is also being put into the chat. Thank you so much again. Have a great rest of your day. And if I could have all of the panelists just wave goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much. Have a great one.